As I start to reflect on my personal philosophy, I realize that my philosophy and my core values have already began to evolve just through going through the IUPUI program and entering the Blacks program. So this semester, I think that the biggest change is that I now see the warm demander pedagogy as kind of the umbrella to my philosophy, and everything else kind of falls underneath, and it finds its place and it fits underneath the warm demander pedagogy. And so Hart 2009 summarizes that the warm demander pedagogy as what it is at the heart of the warm demander's fussing behavior is not a mean-spirited attempt to harm students. It is the caring yet authoritarian explicit explanation that says, I expect more from you. I think this is important for me because I find high expectations for students extremely important, but I also want it to be known that I'm going to support them and encourage them and provide them as many resources as I can so that they can reach those high expectations. And I need to create relationships with my students, and so that I can set those expectations where they can meet them. And Jones and Jones, chapter 3, 2007, said that students need to reach goals. They need to experience accomplishment on a regular basis so that they develop confidence in what they can do, and that they find value in their education. And part of another role of the teacher is to create community within the classroom. And so a little bit later I'll mention the community of learners model, but really creating that community is going to be all me. Community naturally happens, but getting to the level that it needs to be at is really going to be, at the beginning of the year, it's really going to be all on me. And I need to create relationships with my individual students. And so I can create that community of learners, so I can create those expectations. And I think what society misses about a teacher is really all the hats that they wear. So the teacher, the parent, the social worker, the friend, the disciplinarian, and so many more, because you need to meet students where they're at. So you need to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and know that this top tier up here is where students learn, but if they're not receiving their basic needs, that they're not going to be able to reach this top tier. So really meeting students where they need to be, and you're not going to be able to do that unless you create those relationships with students. I will say relationships with students like 20 times in this video. And then the role of the students is that they need to be responsible for the education, they need to create their own goals, and they need to hold themselves accountable for that, and for meeting their individual goals for themselves and reaching the expectations that I have set for them, and taking responsibility for that, not just at school but at home as well. And they also need to realize that they play the most important role in the community of learners, that those peer-to-peer relationships need to happen, and that they need to have respect and acceptance for every single one of their peers within the classroom. So part of that environment in the community of learners is seen in I'm going to link it to the Reggio approach. And so Nasir and Wortham say that when an individual feels that his or her identity is linked to setting, he or she is more engaged and learns more. So that's part of the Reggio approach, making sure that the environment reflects your students, it reflects them as teachers, it reflects them as students, and it reflects their needs and what they need. And I really want to use the environment as an assistant to my behavior management. So if you look at my classroom management plan, I've tried to set my classroom up for this, and having 5 different supply tables around the room that have the exact same supplies to assist in that behavior management. And this goes well with the curriculum too. Our students need to be interested in the curriculum, and that will cut down on behaviors as well, because they're going to start finding value in it. They're going to be interested in what you have to say, and they're going to want to learn more about the things that you're presenting to them. And so Nasir and Han 2008 found that bridging of out-of-school and school knowledge is an important pedagogical technique and has shown promise with respect to learning outcomes in school. And And that's part of their Reggio approach as well, is that really interest-driven curriculum. But you can't create that interest-driven curriculum if you don't have those relationships with your students, because you're not going to know that Bobby's in basketball is interested in basketball, and that Ethan is interested in Minecraft, and Keyshawn is interested in soccer. You're not going to know those things. And you need to make sure that your curriculum reflects real life experiences that are important to them and reflect their values and their experiences, not yours. And now back to the community of learners. We need to run our classroom not just in the adult run model, not just in the student run model, but we and the community of learners. We need to make sure that all three are reflected in our classroom so that we cover all of our bases, because we need to know that not all of our students are going to learn everything in just one of those models. We really need to incorporate all three. Rogoff, 1994, summarizes it nicely when she says that learning is involved in all three instructional approaches. Adult-run instruction deriving from assumptions that learning occurs as a product of transmission from experts to no voice. Children-run instruction or student-run instruction based on assumptions that learning is the product of discovery of knowledge by oneself or with peers. In the community of learners based on assumptions that learning is a process of transforming participation in shared social culture endeavors. So when we get all three, I think that we really cover our bases and that we're going to reach out to different kinds of learners whenever we look at that. And so when we're looking at the normalization of failure and our success, it goes back to reflecting our own opinions and our own bias. Wilson and Skiba say that if our national education leaders are serious about improving the conditions and outcomes of all of our public school students, we cannot afford to leave the issue of discipline out of the debate. So this is something I need to focus on in my own classroom. If my school is not taking initiative to confront the issue of discipline. So for example, if the school that I work at enforces zero tolerance policies, I need to make sure that I'm trying to deal with the behaviors and the conflict in my classroom on my own, instead of sending my students to the office that will end up pushing them down the school to prison pipeline. Wilson and Skiba again, they say that there are concerns about lost instructional time as well as other possible harmful side effects from suspension are amplified by consistent findings that African American and Latino youth are overrepresented in school suspensions, and that the increased use of suspension has been largest for poor minority children. This is important to me. Whenever I came to IUPUI, I wasn't interested in urban education at all, and now it's a passion. And so these facts and a lot of Skiba's work is super important to me, because those are things I need to be worried about. Those are things I constantly need to be thinking about, especially the African American and Latino population that I will have in my classroom. So for me personally, to combat the issue, I plan on using the very simple strategy of keeping track of who I'm disciplining in my classroom. And that's just, having my roster and taking tallies of who I discipline in my classroom. That will help me reflect on myself and what bias I have towards my students that I may not be recognizing that I'm putting out there. Harry, Hart, and Klinger, 2009, say school personnel can learn to monitor the impact of their own beliefs and biases on their professional decision making, and I think that simple strategy will really help in that. The other part is my relationships with students and dealing with classroom management behavior, like I've already talked about. Knowing my students know what's going on in their life, and dealing with the discipline in my classroom again. And I plan on doing this by practicing restorative justice, which is something that was in response to zero tolerance. And it's normally a school-wide initiative, but there are things that I can do in my classroom that I think will, one, support my community of learners, and two, keep my students out of the office. And so one of those simple things are circle practices, whether it be the peace circles or community circle, will really help create those relationships and peer-to-peer and help people keep one another accountable. The other thing I would like to explore after a few years of experience in my classroom would be the student jury, and that's something that I wouldn't just be able to implement right away. That would be a conversation I'd have to have with my principal about restorative justice period, but especially the student jury, and with the parents in my classroom, as well, but that's something that I would like to explore. And this will really help with the community that I have in my classroom, I think. And like I said, holding one another accountable. And then this falls into the discipline as punishment versus discipline as learning. I really see restorative justice as discipline as learning, and the zero tolerance as discipline as punishment. When we use the restorative justice practices that have a direct link to students' behavior that call for corrective action and replacement behaviors are taught, we see discipline as learning. But when students are punished most of the time punitively, as seen in zero tolerance, we see the behavior reoccur. And so I've talked about creating relationships with my students creating relationships with each other, but how am I going to create relationships with parents, and how am I going to construct these families? And I think that's just really creating a sincere relationship with the families, the guardians, the caregivers. And some of the simple strategies that I can do to go about that is the positive phone calls, having really clear communication in a way that they prefer, reaching out to them, and then having meetings on neutral ground. So at the local McDonald's, if they're willing to do a home visit, then that's great. But really making sure that no one feels intimidated and that they're comfortable as possible. And I want to make sure that as parents and teachers, we're working as one. As cited in Danforth and Smith 2005, says parent involvement as an equal and respectful partnership or collaboration between parents and educators. And I think that's super important to me, that we're seen as one, and that will help students as well. So social construction of ability, disability, and behavior, this goes back to my own bias a little bit, and making sure that I'm protecting my students the best that I can. Collins says it is therefore imperative that we begin to identify and understand the influence of social culture factors on the identification of children as gifted, average, or learning disabled. So before I go and try to give my students a label, or before I have them evaluated, I need to make sure that I know my student, and it goes back to those underlying reasons, and that I must be a part of disrupting the social culture thinking by evaluating my bias and my opinion, so that we keep our students from receiving the label. Michael and Collins' narrative, I get into so much trouble just walking, proves that once you receive your label, it is near impossible to get out. Students are seen as less than, no matter how much they achieve. So as a student's teacher, we are responsible to keep this from happening and function on what students can do, and we need to change our own disposition. And I think this really goes back to warm demander coming full circle. I need to set all of my students up for high expectations, and whenever I create those expectations, I can see what my students really can do, and that can combat the labels that others want to put on the students in my classroom. So all of this comes into a full circle and just shows you that it all falls under the warm demander, and that part is really important to me.